First of all, I'm Tim Chapman. I'm the Executive Director of Heritage Action. We're the sister organization of the Heritage Foundation. We do lobbying and advocacy on Capitol Hill and work with grassroots Americans across this country, many of whom I'm excited to announce will be engaged in this effort in the coming weeks and have been engaged. To my left is Representative Jim Banks from Indiana's 3rd District. We are excited to partner with him on this very important topic. He's been a leader on this topic for us, and we expect to see some forward momentum here over in this Congress. Next, we have General Tom Spohr. General Spohr is the director of the Heritage Foundation Center for National Defense. And Dr. Lindsay Burke is the director of the Heritage Foundation Center for Education. So some of you may know that April is the month of the military child, so it's an appropriate time for us to have this conversation. Military families endure many burdens for the service that they do for our country. And one of the burdens that they endure is the need to switch locations frequently. And doing this can be very inconvenient for families, can be a tough burden on these families, especially when you think about the opportunities they may have for getting their children a good education. The Pentagon made policy changes in 2016 in direct response to this that would enable families to remain at duty stations for longer time periods, but there is certainly more work to do here. More than half of all active duty military families live in states with no school choice options. I think that's an important stat to remember. And this is despite the fact that there's overwhelming support amongst military families for school choice. According to a Military Times survey, 35% of respondents said that the dissatisfaction with a child's education was a significant factor in deciding whether or not to continue military service for many of these families. So it really is a national security issue if we are losing service people because of this issue. Consider this. A recent report states that the Air Force was short roughly 1,500 pilots, including 1,200 fighter pilots, and it costs roughly $11 million to train just one pilot. Many of these pilots leaving the military for the private sector. I know this from firsthand. My brother was a weapons system operator in an F-15 Strike Eagle. I saw him spend 9 years of his life getting trained and being deployed 3 times and then saying he had to go. It impacted his family, and that's a huge drain to lose that kind of investment. So the proposal that we're talking about here this morning is legislation H.R. 1605, the Education Savings Accounts for Military Families, sponsored here by Representative Banks. The legislation would provide active duty military families federally funded education savings accounts that they could use to pay for educational products and services that work best for their children, including materials to educate their child at home, private school tuition, district and charter school services, personal tutors, online classes, education therapies, etc. We see a huge need for this. We see a very reasonable strategy coming up where we'd like to attach this in the Senate to the NDAA and think that we have the chance to do that. Senator Mike Lee has partnered with us on that strategy. And I'm also, as I alluded to earlier, happy to announce that tomorrow Heritage Action will release a letter signed by 3,000 military families across this country supporting this piece of legislation. There is real support by real people in the military for this effort. So with that, I would like to begin the questions, and we'll go through a couple. Well, I'll moderate a conversation here this morning. We'll go through a couple questions, and then we'll save some time here at the end if there are questions from the audience. First question for Representative Banks. As one of the most recently deployed members of Congress, why did you decide to serve your country?
Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you to the panel, each of you, for taking an interest in this significant issue. I chose to serve my country in uniform for the same reason that I ran for Congress, to make a difference for my country, to give back, to serve. I put on a different uniform these days in a suit and come to Washington, D.C., but there was no greater honor in my life than putting on the uniform of a Navy officer and doing that in the reserves for 6 or 7 years, going to Afghanistan, putting on the uniform every day in service of my country, this great country. So Tim, I have rarely worked on a piece of legislation that I am as passionate about, if at all, than this piece of legislation. Because there is not well, my service in the reserves was unique and different from those who serve in active duty military settings. There is not a military family who I've ever spoken with who was in the service for any number of years at all, who hadn't dealt with this issue, moving from one duty station to another duty station to another duty station, and being faced with tough choices about the education of their children. I serve on the House Armed Services Committee today. I travel the world and meet with our troops, and this issue is a readiness issue that affects our military families, puts unnecessary stress on our families in the military because parents are faced with the choice of whether or not they accept the next assignment and take their kids to a subpar school that is not as good as the school that they are enrolled in at the moment, either that choice or to get out of the military altogether. That's what makes it fundamentally a readiness issue. But more important than that, this is about right and wrong. Okay, this is about giving our men and women in uniform, our nation's heroes. This is about giving their families the best educational choices that this country can possibly give them. And that's why I'm so passionate about education savings accounts for military families, this legislation. I look forward to talking a lot more with you about lessons that I've learned over the past couple of years of carrying this bill, lessons I've learned from our opposition, how we've retailored the bill from the last version to this version, and the strategy moving forward. So I'll quit rambling with
Yeah,
that.
I think that's great, and I'll come back to you on that because I think that's important. General Spohr, maybe expand a little bit on this issue of readiness and retention, and how you see this particular piece of legislation kind of fixing that problem.
Yeah, so right now, today, it's a tough recruiting environment for the United States military, and part of that has to do with the U.S. unemployment rate, which is at historic lows. As you know, 3.8% unemployment, very low for our country, and there's always been a direct correlation between that and how difficult it is to recruit enough people for the military. But that isn't all that's making things difficult. The United States, the public, is less and less aware of their military. This distance, you hear a lot about it, the civil-military divide is growing because not enough people have either relatives or see service members, so they don't know about it. And so what they do know, they get from TV and they get from movies or they get from commercials. And unfortunately, what you see in the media about the United States military is not always accurate. You see people advertising to support wounded warriors and that type of thing. And so you get this message that everybody that serves comes back wounded, either mentally or physically in some way. And that's clearly not an accurate portrayal, but it's what's out there. It's what the American public sees. And then there's a third dimension, and that is because of growing health problems and other challenges, less and less of America's youth is able to serve. Only 71% of youth aged 17 to 24 are actually even qualified to join the United States military. All those things are combining to make it a very difficult recruiting environment for the United States military. Last year, in 2018, 3 of the 4 services made their recruiting goals. The Army did not. The Army set, admittedly, a very high recruiting goal to recruit 76,000, but they fell short and only were able to recruit 70,000. So they fell about 6,500 short. Now, they say that's because they were inept, that they didn't use social media correctly, that they didn't go to the right cities. They have typically focused on the high payoff places like Texas and Florida, and so now they're re-engaging, trying to get to places like Boston and Philadelphia. There's a reason we have not done well in those because people are not propensed usually to serve, don't desire to serve there. So I think they may get more success in 2019, but I think, at least in my opinion, we're on the cusp of some very difficult recruiting years for the U.S. military. And so this 2018 bump that the Army had, I don't think it's just a 2018 problem. I think it's a long-term problem for the United States military. And you can look at other Western countries, Japan, South Korea, Norway. They are having severe challenges recruiting enough people for the military. Norway went all volunteer, and now Norway is having to go back, I'm sorry, I think it was Sweden, to the draft. And so some people have really they've not been able to attract enough people. So recruiting, in summary, is really, I think we are looking at the edge of some very lean years for the United States military unless we fundamentally change something. Retention, the ability to keep people in the military service that are in there now, is pretty good right now. But Tim mentioned some problems. So pilots in the Air Force, pilots in the Army, probably pilots in the Navy that I'm not aware of, they are leaving for commercial opportunities. And so retention, by and large, is pretty good, but there are isolated pockets where the military is having trouble keeping people. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Lindsay, why don't you walk through exactly what the legislation does and why this is such a good fit for military families?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tim, and thanks, Representative Banks, for being here, and General Spohr for walking us through all of this. My area of expertise is education policy, so it's always really interesting and informative to hear from our national security team on the challenges that our armed services face, and they are great. I mean, a 6,500 person shortfall is no small shortfall at all, and it's really interesting to hear how that shortfall is sort of almost, at least the approach to getting those members is region specific, that the military would go to a state like Texas to recruit. And it is interesting if you look at the states that have active duty personnel above a 100,000 number figure. There are 4 states that have more than 100,000 military families there, and Texas is one of those states, as is California, Virginia, and North Carolina. Those 4 states have more than 100,000 active duty personnel. And so if you look at those states and then you contrast that with the education policy challenges and just the landscape of educational opportunity in those states, the issues become pretty clear. And so I wonder if that nexus in Texas has a lot to do with the lack of educational options that are there. If you look at Texas, just 28% of 8th graders in Texas can read proficiently. 28% of 8th graders. Same situation in California. They're actually 1 percentage point higher. 29% of 8th graders in California can read proficiently. You get a little better rate in places like Virginia and North Carolina, where it's over a third there. But overall, if we look at the educational outcomes in these states, they're pretty dire. And Tim correctly drew our attention to the fact that if you look across the country, half of all military families live in states with 0 school choice options at all. And it's such a contrast if you think about that relative to how education choice is really progressing in the states. We now have 29 states and DC and Puerto Rico that operate 65 private school choice programs today. So that could be something like an education savings account, which is this approach that we'll talk about. Could be a voucher option, a tax credit scholarship option. And so we're seeing wonderful choice expansion in the states, but the federal government is the only entity that can provide to military families education choice that is actually portable across state lines, which is where this proposal comes into play. So this proposal is innovative and critically needed. This is something that would provide an education savings account of about $6,000 to eligible active duty military families. So an eligible student would receive an ESA, an education savings account of $6,000, and that money could then be used to pay for any education-related service, product, or provider of choice. So as Representative Banks alluded to a minute ago, that could be private school tuition, it could be online learning. If a child needed special education services and therapies, that would qualify. It could be charter school courses and even individual public school courses. And one of the most notable facets of an ESA is that unused funds can be rolled over from year to year. This is just an incredible innovation, even within the school choice space. It enables parents to be really targeted and intentional about how they're spending their child's share of education funding. So to have an option that is that flexible, that is portable across state lines, and that innovative is exactly the type of approach that, and by the way, is consistent with the U.S. military's overall goals of improving competition in the sector. So a really smart approach that would go a long ways in improving hopefully both recruitment and retention efforts.
Wonderful. I want to just highlight something that was kind of a subtext to what Lindsay was saying. She talked about this being a great approach for a federal action on the issue of school choice. who we've been working a lot with the administration, who we disagree with on whether or not there should be a federal school choice or federal tax credit for school choice. They want to do something federally on this issue because they are right that this issue is a powerful issue, and it's an important issue for Republicans to be leading on. There's no doubt about it. We think that this is a good way to do it. That this could, if you have the desire to do something federally on school choice, there's a very appropriate way to do it, and it's when we're talking about this issue. So there's a little subtext there. Representative Banks, you talked about lessons learned. I'd be interested, I think a lot of people here would be interested in, because you've been doing this now for a few years. And so you've been able to interact with your colleagues, maybe cross the aisle some, talk to some Democrats. Where are kind of the fault lines in the conference right now? And then the fault lines, are there any opportunities to make inroads with Democrat support here?
Well, I hope so. I haven't given up yet, at least. But let me go back to the very beginning. In 2017, when we first introduced the first iteration of the Military Families Education Savings Account legislation, we funded it using impact aid dollars. And we received a great deal of resistance from lawmakers who come from districts who receive a fair amount of impact aid dollars that fund area public schools that offset as offsets to area public schools in those districts. So Tim, I was a brand new freshman congressman at the time. So imagine my surprise when I met many of my colleagues who I considered conservative colleagues, but they were howling about this piece of legislation because at that point it was receiving a lot of attention because of the great work of you guys and others. At that point we had 77 co-sponsors of that first version of the bill, but on both the Education Committee and the Armed Services Committee, which I serve on both of those committees, a number of my colleagues were against that legislation. Now here's what I learned. The impact aid dollar funded schools have their own lobbying entities that are funded by, guess what? Your impact aid dollars, your tax dollars. They go to fund these different entities that are set up to support the status quo and to protect the impact aid dollars. So that became a very difficult hill to climb politically and in the Congress to use impact aid funding. It was the number one complaint that we got about the bill. In fact, when Secretary DeVos came before the House Education Committee, and I had the first opportunity I had to question her, that was her. At that point, on behalf of the administration, opposed our legislation because of, in her explanation, because of the impact aid aspect of the bill. So, but she did commit at the time to help us come up with a version of the bill that she could support, and that's what led to the version with Dr. Burke and others that we worked on. That where we are today, we've reintroduced the bill, but without using impact aid dollars to fund the education savings accounts. So currently, we have 40 co-sponsors. You're right. You talked about the Senate potentially including this in the NDAA. I serve on the House Armed Services Committee, and that's a strategy that we have as well on the House side. Recently, we've been in discussions with the different service secretaries, and specifically, I questioned Secretary Spencer, the Secretary of the Navy, a few weeks ago, who showed before the House Armed Services Committee that he has a real issue because he understands the nature of recruiting and the retention issues in the Navy, showed a real interest in the legislation. So the Department of Education and the different service branches are talking about different ways that we might be able to use. In the NDA, we might be able to include language that would create pilot programs. I can't speak on behalf of the Navy, but it appears, just from my vantage point, that the Navy might be a realistic place to start to create a pilot program with the Navy. Now, the latest feedback I've received from Secretary DeVos before the latest House Education Committee, the last time that I questioned her 6 or 8 weeks ago, was that she would rather, Dr. Burke, she would rather that the Pentagon own this program rather than the Department of Education. There might be some merit to that, something we can discuss and debate moving forward.
Yeah, wonderful. And did the change in the funding stream, I mean, so you've now got, the administration more on board. How's that changing the dynamic in terms of your colleagues in Congress and their willingness to be
It helps when the Secretary of Education doesn't tell the committee that she's opposed to your bill.
Yeah.
Which is what happened the first time that we introduced it, which was very disappointing, by the way, because there are reasons that we should reform the impact aid dollars, but we decided that tactfully, because we care so deeply about this legislation, we would remove that political obstacle and look for other funding streams and take impact aid out of the equation.
And it was telling that none of the opposition initially was based on the underlying idea. It was all about funding streams.
That's exactly right.
Okay, great, thank you. General, back to you. Well, I'm going to ask you the flip side of what I asked you the first thing about retention and readiness. So what can we do to actually fix that problem? What can be done to help recruit and retain, make the retention a better dynamic?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I just wanted to add before I answer your question, this has got a personal aspect to me. I was in Missouri, assigned to Fort Leonard Wood out there, and got orders to Northern Virginia. And so my wife and I were happy about that because Northern Virginia schools have a great reputation and, world nationwide of being good. And so we accepted housing at Fort Belvoir, and little did we know or even realize that, and I don't want to cast any aspersions, but the high school that services Fort Belvoir is right at the bottom of those in Virginia for high schools. And I won't name names, and I also recognize the danger of judging high schools based on test scores and things like that. But their test scores are very bad. And so we were kind of in a quandary because we'd been celebrating that we're going to now return from Missouri and get the benefit of Northern Virginia schools. So we made the tough decision to enroll my son in a Catholic high school. And I was a colonel at the time. And so colonels, you have this image of a well-paid individual. I didn't know how I was going to make it financially, honestly, because just a lot of things going on. So I had to take money from my father-in-law, which was, I'm a proud man, and so it's not something that I relish doing, but I didn't know how we were going to make the ends meet. And so even I, as a colonel, to put my son in what we considered a decent high school, had to get money from an external source. And as it turns out, it was about $6,000 a year, and that made it work for us. And so you think about that kind of person, think about the military the vast majority of the military at lower pay grades faced with a similar kind of decision. But to your question, Tim, I'm of the opinion that the marginal value of more pay, we're almost there. I don't know that it's pay that's causing people not to join the military. I think it's a worry about what this will do. Can they hack it in the military? There's all these misconceptions about what goes on in the military. I speak in the same auditorium to our interns that come to Heritage, and I talk to them about a military career, and afterwards they come up to me and they say, hey, I'm really excited about this. I want to serve my country, but I don't think I can hack it. I just, from what I've been told about the military, there's no way I could make it. And I was like, well, you look okay. Is there something wrong with you? Is this, are you suffering from some terminal disease or something? Because the military prides itself on getting people to not kicking them out, to actually make them standards. And so there's this misinformation about what it means and what it takes to join the U.S. military. So I've been thinking hard about how do we get military? And I think we have to think non-traditionally about this. I don't think just offering more money on the recruiter as a bonus or something like that is going to get it. I think we have to appeal to other areas that we have not yet appealed to, and maybe look at non-traditional things like education savings account. Might be a way to get people that are currently not disposed to joining to come in.
Yeah, wonderful. One more question for Lindsay, and then I'll open it up to the audience if you all have questions. Talk through that $6,000 number. There's detractors who would kind of try to critique this and say, that's not enough money for private school. Talk through the number and how we came there.
Yeah, well, as General Spohr just said, $6,000 was about what you needed. And when you look across the country nationally, if you look at maybe your typical Catholic school, it tends to sort of hover around that amount. Think about what does an enlisted guy make when he joins? It's, you said as a colonel you were in a better position than the enlisted guy. So if you're coming in and you're not super wealthy, coming in and all of a sudden you have a proposal that says, we're going to de-link housing from where your child has to attend school, that is a really powerful motivator. And so if all of a sudden maybe you have two children as that enlisted gentleman who enters the military, all of a sudden we're talking about $12,000 and a real de-linking there. And for someone who is maybe middle income, that amount of money, even if it doesn't cover your total tuition, can make the difference for you to be able to afford tuition. So that's, I think, just a general way to think about when you're hearing various school choice proposals across the country. That's something that comes up quite frequently. Is it actually enough to cover full tuition? It might be, it might not be in a lot of cases, but it can make the difference. And just a couple of other things that I wanted to bring up. When we talk about military families moving, they move frequently. If you're like me and this isn't something that you're steeped in, you might not realize how frequently they move. We did a survey with EdChoice, formerly the Friedman Foundation, 2 years ago. It's a nationally representative survey. And we found in that survey that 40% of military families have enrolled their oldest child in at least 4 schools. I mean, that's a lot of moves for any family. 44% of those military families had taken on a new job to support their child's K-12 education versus 21% of the civilian population. And 1/3 of military families in our survey had taken out a loan to finance their child's K-12 education versus 11% of the civilian population. That really blew my mind that families were taking out loans for their child's K-12 schooling. So military families are making sacrifices. We all know this, that the civilian population does not, but that extends to their education options as well. And the last thing I would say on that, and just you heard it here first, we have an update to the survey coming out in a couple of months, so really excited to re-release that. So we'll be building off of the survey from 2017, but one of the most notable findings to me in that survey was that although 34% and just 34% of military families in our survey said that they would choose a traditional district school, 80% of military children are enrolled in a traditional public school. So there's a significant misalignment between what military families are looking for and what they actually have access to. And I guess one last thing I would say from that survey is that we actually tested this specific proposal. And we asked our respondents, again, nationally representative survey of active duty military families, whether or not they would support a proposal at the federal level to provide education savings accounts to active duty families. And written just that way, 72% of respondents supported that. We only had 15% in opposition to it. So it's something that while we might hear these special interest groups in DC howl and cry about this proposal, military families, it is a kitchen table issue for them, and it is something that they support strongly.
Yeah, wonderful. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll go through and call on you. And we have a microphone right here, so right here is a question.
Hi, John Grady, Naval Institute. Question on the sea services, I'll come to that. And then the other thing is 30 to 40% of the military live on base. And when you take out the singles, meaning the unmarried with no children, that number drops even lower. So most of them are living in the community. Mm-hmm. Are there particular problems that you have seen in these survey results, including the Military Times ones, related to the sea services, because they have a different rotation policy than the Army and certainly different than the Air Force? So are those factors in? And then one other question related to that, is the Coast Guard in that, since they were the ones who got hammered, and none of them are, or virtually none of them are living on a base?
Thank you.
I'll just say one really quick thing on that, and then let the military experts respond to the rest of that, some of which I didn't even understand. So just 4%. Yes, correct. So to that point, just 4% of children of active duty military families attend school on base. So 96% attend a school around base, 80% of those attend a district public school. So this proposal is geared toward those 96% of families who do not have a child who attends school on base.
I think you hit the nail on the head. This is why Secretary Spencer acknowledged before the House Armed Services Committee when I questioned him that this is an issue that he's thought deeply about, that's affected too many sailors and their families in the Navy, and something that, I mean, he talked about his business background. This seems like his business, not political background, so this seemed like a common sense approach to take care of a major problem that he faces every day as Secretary of the Navy. He specifically talked about the inconsistent educational options that exist for families in his service, and encouraged us to keep marching down this path.
I don't think I have anything to add. I'm not aware, I mean, I guess the sea services sometimes have the ability to stay longer at an installation while they're serving. Sorry?
Families do.
Yes.
The sailor and the marine.
Yes, yeah, that's what I mean. And so they may have a better opportunity to better situate themselves in terms of school choices wherever they are, but I don't think that's hugely significant, honestly.
Other questions? I have one in the meantime, and maybe Lindsay, you can take the lead on this. Kind of what are the leading edge kind of attacks on this piece of legislation that we're getting, and kind of talk through the rebuttal to some of them.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the attack is not dissimilar to the attacks we heard with the impact aid funding. And, impact aid funding, it is a unique funding source. It exists to provide additional federal funding to areas where there is a displaced local property tax base because there's a federal presence, whether that's military or even something like a national park. So there are some unique financing aspects. Our response to that has always been, it really doesn't matter, right? Whatever public funding we provide to a student, military or otherwise, that funding should be provided to the family, full stop. Whatever that family then wants to use that funding for to provide the best education possible for their child, they should be able to access. So this whole idea of separating the financing of education from the delivery of services would extend to any revenue source, federal, state, local, whatever it might be. And so there's that's the continued line of attack that I think we'll hear no matter what moving forward, that what will happen to traditional public schools in the wake of any education choice proposal. And, this is something that you hear from many opponents of education choice, but we should be far less concerned about the physical school building and far more concerned about actual education of the public. And this gets back to the old Milton Friedman argument, right? Yes, publicly financed education, but that does not mean that education has to be delivered through government schooling. And so what this proposal does is it gets us to that point where we are actually separating the financing from the delivery. And one of the things that I like to point out on that, and if you've ever heard me talk about education choice, you've probably heard me say this, but there was a great chart that Milton Friedman put out decades ago that talked about the 4 ways that you can spend money on anything. And education savings accounts are a really good example of this. So he said, you can spend your own money on yourself, you can spend your own money on somebody else, you can spend somebody else's money on yourself, or you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. This is how public schools spend money. They spend somebody else's money, taxpayer dollars, your taxpayer dollars, on somebody else's children. So there's no incentive there to align services and products in a way that meets the needs of children and is a good value. This proposal and education savings accounts broadly get us much closer to that first example. It's much more like spending your own money, and it is your own money, on your own children. And so all of the incentives are aligned correctly, increasing value and ensuring that you have access to whatever option is the best fit for your child. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's a process of fit that a family should direct, not some bureaucrat who has never met a child and doesn't know her name.
Wonderful.
Not to mention, having served in the Armed Services Committee, faced with the daunting rising cost of retention and recruitment, I mean, this solves a fiscal issue as well. If we can better retain and prepare our troops, take away these stresses from their lives, and that 50% of, a little bit less than 50% of military families that either think strongly or altogether get out of the service because of poor educational options for their kids, and we can keep those service members in the military, that will save us a tremendous amount of money in the long term.
Yeah.
Let me just add one more thing. And again, I always go local with me. And now I live in Alexandria. In our high school, they are T.C. Williams. Remember the Titans. is got a huge capacity problem. They have way more students than their physical plant can currently hold. So they're going through these agonizing decisions about should we build a new high school or how do we do this? This proposal, the way I understand it, would contribute to that solution because the biggest expenditure that they have in the entire city budget would be the construction of a new high school. And this would, because so much of the military, so much of their students are military connected, might have a real chance of solving some of that problem.
Yeah, and can I just say on that, so this is something, so if you look across the country at various school choice programs, I mentioned earlier there are 65 options out there now. Often that's exactly what you see. It's not that there's a mass exodus from the district system. If the district's meeting the needs of families well, there will be no mass exodus. But often it serves as just sort of a little release valve for the district system, especially, if you go to Texas or somewhere where they are bursting at the seams in some places, where you have schools with trailers and what have you. This really can act for them as just a little bit of a pressure release valve. And so that's another benefit. I would totally agree with that.
Congressman, walk through the kind of legislative terrain that we see ourselves in right now. I mean, obviously, we're in the minority in the House, but there are still things, that we're doing together to push this. And what strategically do you think we could hope for in the near term, and how would that unfold?
Well, currently, we have 40 co-sponsors. Compare that to 77 last time around, and I'm pleased with that because we're just getting started. So one way that you can help is to help us put pressure on members who are inclined to support an initiative like this and ask them to co-sponsor the bill. That first and foremost. That does a lot for us. That brings more attention to the issue. Once we pass the 77 co-sponsor mark, we can champion this initiative and say we're doing better than we did last time, and I think that could happen hopefully in the first half of this year. So secondly, we have the NDAA coming up and the Armed Services Committee, and because the House Democrat agenda isn't exactly robust, we're wasting a lot of time these days not doing a whole lot of anything. There will be very few bills that move through the process. Even altogether moving through the process, you'll see very few legislative items move through the House and the Senate. But the NDAA is one vehicle that will, without a shadow of a doubt, actually go through the process and be signed by the president. So that is one vehicle where I can offer an amendment, or Senator Sass or others on the Senate side, you mentioned Senator Lee, can offer an amendment in the Senate and require a vote for an initiative like this. So that's our dual track. While I'm not naive enough to believe that Speaker Pelosi will put this bill in its entirety on the floor for a vote. We could force an amendment vote on the NDAA for either a pilot or for a more well-rounded version of what we've introduced.
And we'll be working with you on that for certain at Heritage Action. I misspoke earlier and said Mike Lee was the lead. It's always Mike Lee's the lead on so many of our things that he can kind of just jumps the pot top of mind. We've worked with Cotton, Sass, and Senator Scott on this one that have taken the lead and have done a fantastic job. So we'll be working with them, especially on the Senate side, to try and make sure that we get an amendment on this on the NDAA. And look, this is the kind of thing. The NDAA gets so big, and if you could get it on the bill in committee, you could see a way that it could potentially survive a conference. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. We're definitely going uphill here, but we'll be working with you to that end. If there are no other questions, I have one or two more before we conclude. And Lindsay, maybe you take the lead on this. Describe the consensus that's being built in the policy community around this. Who are our allies? And so talk about a coalition.
Yeah, so the really nice thing about working in the education choice space is I think the coalition is pretty fantastic. It's strong, and people broadly agree around the efficacy, particularly, obviously, within the school choice community, of proposals like this. There are, sort of nitpicky ideas within that sort of community about best paths forward. But I will say, if you go to a state today and you talk to a state policymaker or you work with groups like the State Policy Network, I think there's pretty broad consensus now that if a state or even a proposal like this at the federal level is going to advance education choice, that ESAs are a really smart way to do that. It is, very, I think, we're in a good position now to be able to even talk about innovation within this innovative space of education, that this is an innovation on the old voucher idea, right? I mean, even vouchers are so innovative still today in and of itself, but to be able to use that funding to direct literally every single penny in an account to a service that is the right fit for your child is such an innovation. To be able to roll over year to year into a college savings account, which we didn't mention earlier, is an innovation. So, the coalition's fantastic. It's groups like EdChoice who are here. It's groups like the State Policy Network, the American Federation for Children, groups that have really worked to put education choice and education choice for military families at the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I mean, maybe Representative Banks, you can talk about this a little bit. I mean, what's attractive about this is that flexibility, right? The flexibility that it gives military family members, and just kind of talk through some of the different ways they can use the funds in a very kind of detailed, granular way.
Yeah, I mean, once again, just to boil this down to what matters, we're either going to continue to be a country and society that believes that our military families, as they move from place to place, should be stuck in schools that are subpar from one to the next, and trap them in educational options that don't work for them, or we're a country that believes that we should take care of our military families. And once we determine that, then we get to solutions like this. So these military education savings accounts would pay for private school tuition, online programs, as Lindsay said before, textbooks, AP exams, apprenticeship or vocational programs, 529 contributions, just to name a few options. One thing that we haven't talked a lot about today is homeschooling. Homeschooling is a great option for many families, whether they're in the military or not. In the military, though, homeschooling is a choice that's chosen by families twice as much as civilian families.
Because it gives the kids some continuity.
That's right.
Yeah.
So this would help fund textbooks and other supplies for homeschool families. But that statistic in and of itself is the reason that we're debating this issue, because in many cases our military families are left with homeschooling as the only option versus the public school option, which might not be a good fit for them. And legislation like this helps offset some of the costs involved with that, if not allowing them to choose a different choice altogether.
And Tim, can I just put one other point on that? So we, a few years ago now, went out to Arizona to visit a family who was using an ESA. So Arizona was the first state to ever do an education savings account option. There are now 6 states that have them in place. And it was great because we went to a home of a mother who had a young boy. He was probably 7 or 8 at the time, and was on the autism spectrum and needed some special attention. She had actually moved her family from Minnesota to Arizona because the only way to get him services in Minnesota was to engage in this litigious sort of debate with the school district, which was not ideal. So she moves to Arizona because they had an education savings account option in place. And it was just amazing to see it in action. So we go over to film the family, and a private tutor comes over to their home and his name was EJ, gives EJ a lesson in, I think it was math that day, and exactly what he needed. EJ, she comes in, he runs up, hugs her. He had this great relationship with his private tutor that his mother had chosen. The lesson wraps up. The mom pulls out her education savings account debit card, swipes it on the tutor's iPhone, pays the tutor directly for that perfectly aligned service that child needed. I mean, that's the type of innovation that we need to really foster educational excellence throughout the country, and really serve our armed services as well as they serve us.
Absolutely. Wonderful. All right. Well, we need to get the congressman back for votes on the Hill, but please thank me in joining our panelists, and thank you all for coming.